Travis Taylor is a professor of economics and honors program faculty in the College of Social Sciences at Christopher Newport University. Dr. Taylor's research and teaching interests include the economics of international contracting, industrial policy and strategy, and sports and economics. Travis, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to be with you.
So to start, could we start with kind of a foundation of what is international public procurement and what does it look like right now?
Sure. So this is one area of my research, and when we think about public procurement, this is just the purchasing of goods and services from the most mundane of food, pencils, staplers, toilets, to the more headliners of weapon systems, jet airplanes, tanks, and so forth. So in total, the United States, for example, as a government, procures, that's why it's called public procurement, because it's from the government sector. So public procurement from the United States typically averages about 500 to 600 billion dollars per year. So we aren't talking about chump change. So that's just the United States. When studies have looked up the entire world market for public procurement, the most recent estimate shows it about 12 to 13 trillion dollars per year. So we are talking about a very sizable market that is right for lots of multinational corporations um, for sales opportunities.
Yeah. Well, so what does this look like right now at the international level? Is this countries purchasing what the goods and services you described from each other, and what are kind of the systems right now?
There is considerable amount of international transactions. I'm sure today we'll talk a fair amount about the recent rise in protectionism. That's in a way that's throwing sand in the gears of the international trading order. But generally, it's been a very vibrant world market. It generally increases economic efficiency, which, as economists, we love that. You can't do everything, no matter the size of the country. You can't do everything extremely well. So engaging in free trade does tend to lower costs, increase innovation, increase productivity, and provide more value for taxpayers. So generally, we like this. This grew out of what's called the GATT, so the GATT, which was replaced, that was in the 1970s, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which again is a number of countries voluntarily agreeing to this. So it wasn't forced upon countries. But the Western countries, the advanced countries of the world, saw the benefits of general move towards free trade. And so they led the charge of the GATT. And one component of the GATT was called the General Procurement Agreement, so the GPA. So the General Procurement Agreement. Um, and then that's been shepherded on by the WTO because the World Trade Organization, the WTO, eventually replaced the GATT, okay, in the 1990s. And this GPA, headed by the WTO, has espoused free trade principles in government purchasing all around the world for, again, the most mundane items, all the way up to more expensive national security aerospace things. However, there are carve-outs, understandably, for national security, um, developing country status, um, environmental, public health. So there are, even if you're a signatory, even if your country signs up for this agreement and you in general support these free trade principles for public procurement across the world, there are understandable, and I would support these types of carve-outs. So there are exceptions and waivers for example, again, defense weaponry, environmental, public health. You know, we learned a lot from COVID-19, for example, the fact that the United States um, found itself without even sufficient domestic mass production and so forth. And so there's these types of carve outs. Okay. But generally, this has been the approach, really, again, since GATT reaffirmed with the WTO in the 1990s for non-discriminatory free trade principles. So that is to say, if you're a Japanese firm, you should be able to bid when there's a government, releases a solicitation or a request for proposal. Um, you know, it shouldn't just be targeted in general. This approach says it shouldn't just be targeted at domestic firms.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about a couple other concepts.
Sure.
What is countertrade and what are offsets? Could you kind of define those for us?
Absolutely. So this is really interesting to me. This was something, Joe, um, that I came upon when I was just a graduate student at the University of Connecticut, and I was trying to find topics. I was very interested in defense economics, and I worked as a defense economist in Washington, D.C. for the federal government before I ultimately ended up in academia. And so it was interesting to me. And so then I think I did a special topics course in defense economics in grad school, and I was particularly attracted to the arms trade. And so I studied a lot about the arms trade and characteristics, features, what types of industries and markets, what makes the arms trade different than regular markets and regular exchange. And the short answer is there's a lot different. So it's kind of like the opposite of when we teach econ students of a perfectly competitive market. So when I teach my intro students about hey, let's go buy a cup of coffee, and we're aware of lots of competitors just down the street. And so if one competitor is overpricing its product, then we'll certainly just walk down the street and get another rival's cup of coffee. And, as a consumer, we have really good information about the quality and the taste of that cup of coffee. And if we're not happy with that cup of coffee, right, or the service, then it's easy for us to just, take our money next time and go somewhere else. And that's the way free markets are supposed to work. In the defense realm, though, and aerospace realm, it's almost the opposite of that. It's characterized as an imperfectly competitive market. So typically, there's only a handful, a small number of firms that, again, are supplying this product. There is significant asymmetric information, right? So, as opposed to the coffee, right, where the buyers and sellers know basically really quickly if that's good functioning cup of coffee, it's not so clear when you have these really advanced radar systems or a new type of missile technology, um, the most advanced telecommunication system. It won't become apparent until later. So there's a lot of asymmetric information. So there's a lot of deviation from competitive markets. And so and one of the features is contracts have turned to counter trade agreements and offsets. So under the umbrella of counter trade would be things that basically attach reciprocity to the sale. So let's say, as an example, that I am Lockheed Martin or Boeing, and I am looking to sell my um, F-16 jet to Poland, which happened in 2003, by the way. So one of the most famous large counter-trade offset deals was in 2003. And Lockheed Martin said to Poland, we really want to sell you these F-16 jets. If it was just a normal standard free market, well, that would be it. There would be competition based off of price and quality of the jets, and there would be good information flow, and there would be a lot of other competition, a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers, and we'd end up at that kind of equilibrium. In this case, no. We had a significant deviation from the perfectly competitive market. There were just mainly three suppliers of the jets. So they were the Poles were considering a French jet, the Mirage, and I believe a Swedish jet. It might have been the Gripen, but you had a triopoly, so just three firms. So it's called an oligopoly. And it was also at the time more or less a buyer's market. It was a buyer's market. So Poland was able to extract significant extra benefits in order to for Lockheed to make the sale. And so what's striking about this, Joe, is that in these types of industries and market exchanges, is that a lot of these governments, when they're purchasing the aerospace or defense products, instead of just bargaining down the price of the F-16 jets, they're asking the supplier to include what are called extra offsets or sweeteners, if you will. So kind of like extra benefits to the Polish economy that may or may not be related to the actual F-16 itself.
Hmm.
That's what, when I was a grad student, I found that so compelling. And so then a number of years, I worked on that area of research because as economists, right, we normally think of the most efficient process in the marketplace would be bargaining, and we see changes in prices when you have one party that has more leverage than another party. But here, right, governments around the world were leaving the price margin, leaving just focusing on price, not even just focusing on technical superiority of the product of the F-16 itself, but also introducing and looking at what are called offsets. And so offsets is a type of counter trade. So it's kind of two related terms, but really counter trade is the umbrella term. Counter trade is the, like, you think of just reciprocal trade. And honestly, the most the easiest way to think about it is barter. So barter is attaching and trading goods for goods instead of just currency money. And so barter would just be one type of counter trade, but now barter is by far not the most common. So it is under counter trade, but now there's other types of more sophisticated counter trade, including offsets that are more common in a lot of world trade. I mean, today I'm focusing more on like offsets and or the defense industry and the aerospace industry, but you can also certainly see it in telecommunications. You can see it in infrastructure projects such as railroads, transportation. So there are defense and civil cases where this is present. So I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Well, so in those cases, what you described as a public or a government buying something from a private company, but then the sweeteners maybe aren't related to the private company. How does it work where you have is this where it becomes kind of a trade policy negotiation, or is it like in this example, Lockheed collaborating with the US government to say what sweeteners can you help us give Poland, or who are the transactors in
Yeah,
this situation?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, so fundamentally, it's going to be a private. Typically, it's a private firm like Lockheed, and then selling to a foreign government. We're not talking offsets are not usually referred to private sales. So it would be a private sale and then a government buyer. But here's the catch. For the actual implementation of the offset, the sweetener to the purchasing government's economy, that all depends on how the particular country, let's say Poland in this case, wants to set it up. So there you do get into public-private partnerships between the Polish government and local private sector firms within Poland. Yeah. So that introduces a lot of, again, interesting questions of, hmm, how is government going to select the recipient firms of these sweeteners, of these benefits? Is it thought out very methodically, strategically, in an efficient and transparent manner, or is it subject to what? Bribery, corruption, and so forth. This has been a real source of concern in the counter-trade offsets community. And so even the international publication called Transparency International issued a report. Transparency International annually does different reports about uh, waste and fraud in government around the world. And so I remember a number of years ago, they did a whole annual report focused on offsets and the way to, suggestions to improve the transparency and increase audits of offset agreements in order to, again, increase efficiency, reduce the likelihood of that type of corruption. Because you're right, you're going to, if you want to help the Polish economy, you're going to have to, you know, um, bring in the Ministry of the Economy to work with the Defense Department, because the Defense Department is the one that's typically, uh, initially taking the lead in the purchase of the F-16 jets. But then they have to work with the Ministry of the Industry or the Ministry of the Economy in order to develop the right sweeteners, if you will. And so I can just briefly go through some of the types of sweeteners. So there's a whole long list. So you could include just things like counter purchase agreements. So this would be, for example, Lockheed is ultimately responsible for buying, X amount of dollars worth of products from Polish companies in the next 5 years.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, typically what happens, Joe, is that Lockheed Martin, they might be able to purchase some for their own company's use, but it may be something that is not of interest to Lockheed Martin. And so then what these companies do, these big defense contractors, and I know you told me you worked with a firm that did some defense contracting, but they basically outsource that activity. So they work with third-party trading companies. So if Lockheed has a counter purchase agreement that they have to fulfill with Poland, then they might sign a deal with a trading company, and then the trading company helps to fulfill the deal. Okay. So you could have counter purchase, you could have technology transfer. That has increased in recent decades. It used to be that offsets were dominated by things like barter and simple subcontracting. So maybe a Polish company might provide really low end um, rubber that ultimately could be used for the tires that go on the F-16 jet itself. So that would be a low level subcontracting. But in the last couple of decades, I've noticed that a lot of our trade partners have, especially the advanced economies, they've become, more sophisticated in their requests. And so they're looking at things like, again, tech transfer, even educational exchanges. So I'm aware of an agreement between, for example, the UK and Malaysia, where a British company sold some defense products to Malaysia. And then as part of the offset fulfillment, the British company arranged to take and train Malaysian officials and Malaysian engineers, and they were brought over to England and attended English universities to improve their defense, engineering, and management skills to take back to Malaysia. So it's a long list actually of ways that these offsets can be fulfilled.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a more general question now. What are some common misconceptions about industrial policy and strategy?
Okay, so you can see for the viewers today, you can see the connection because we just talked about, hey, we've got these international public procurement agreements, right? And then sometimes these international sales to foreign governments are going to trigger a counter trade or offset deal. And so then, as we just discussed, if it does trigger an offset or a counter trade, then as a government, a purchasing government, we want to make best use of that opportunity. And so you have to have some sort of industrial policy or strategy, right? You don't want to go into this haphazardly. You don't want it to be ad hoc. Ideally, you'd want to have strategy that fits a long-term economic development plan for the economy. So this is where industrial policy comes into play. And so technically industrial policy, the term, is just defined as government trying to influence the quantity, quality, product mix of different industries in the private sector. Okay. So yes, it is a deviation from pure free trade principles, but we've found that lots of countries, if you actually look at world economic history, almost every country that has developed into first world advanced economy status has actually used industrial policy in some capacity. Okay. It used to be a bad word, honestly, Joe. When I was in college, it was really never discussed. When I was in graduate school and just starting my career, industrial policy was really out of favor between 1980 and I would say about 2000 up to the Great Recession. So from 1980 to about 2008, um, you'd be hard pressed to see a lot of serious economists supporting industrial policy because it has distortionary effects on the market. And I personally, as a fan of well-designed procurement policy and well-designed offset policy, I I was always pushing back slightly on that pure free trade narrative. I generally support free trade principles. I think that's really helpful. Um, Far superior to just being a hermit kingdom like North Korea and not trading, right? That's not the secret sauce of long-term economic development. So in general, I certainly support free trade principles, but the pendulum in academic research and then in policy circles, I believe the pendulum had swung too far to world neoliberal, laissez-faire, hands-off, market is king, and that's all that can be said. I think the pendulum had swung too far, so I think it's actually a good thing. If you just ask my professional opinion, I think it's a good thing that the pendulum has swung a little bit back with some of the recent industrial policies that the United States passed in the last few years. And we can talk about those if you want.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into those and just kind of get a sense for how economists think about what's good policy, what's bad policy, how we evaluate policies. So could we start with the CHIPS Act and what's happened there and how you think about that?
Sure. So for the viewers who haven't been keeping up with this, the Science and Chips Act um, was one of the stools. If you think about the different stools or pillars of recent U.S. industrial policy. So from 2021 to 2023, there was the passage of several key massive industrial policies that heretofore would have been really shocking. If you actually look at the dollar totals and again the swinging of the pendulum. So you had the Science and Chips Act, which targeted the creation of self-sustaining semiconductor chips, reducing our reliance on foreign country production of these all-important chips, primarily in terms of the most advanced chips, right, coming from Taiwan. So if you actually look at the most advanced types of chips, even though some of the earlier design of the chips, and still to this day, some of the early design was based out of the United States and other countries, the actual fabrication and the making of the chips, 90% of it is coming from a small island right next to China. So for geopolitical reasons, it makes sense to wean ourselves off of that reliance. And so this was $250 billion with a B that was provided as grants and low interest loans, subsidies effectively. So it really wasn't the tariff part. The chips was more the subsidy part, giving grants to companies, both American companies and foreign companies, including the Taiwanese TSMC and Samsung, for example, from South Korea, to build facilities, these fabs in the United States. And if you've been following the news, you know that now recently TSMC's fab in Arizona is now online. So they've made significant progress. There was a little bit of of as expected, some difficulty getting the labor in place in the United States. Workers weren't used to working the types of hours and having the types of maybe command structure that was found in the Taiwanese TSMC market. But from all reports, significant progress has been made there. It also includes things like R&D funding. So this is not just for the mere fabrication and production of the chip itself, but also money is in there for research and development, which you hope that the research and development eventually helps to raise American productivity. So that's a good thing. That's just one of the pillars, though. So you also have the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really confusing to a lot of people, understandably, why it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, because initially there is no inflation reduction. So it's a little bit of a misnomer. The hope is that, well, let me step back. It's really better thought of as the Green New Deal. It's really better thought of as the Green New Deal because it's the biggest green friendly types of promotional policies that the United States has really ever undertaken. Now, the Trump administration is trying to push that back. But this was a mix of massive subsidies for the promotion of environmentally friendly inputs such as batteries, EVs, uh, wind technology, solar technology, these types of things, along with some tariff protection. Um, so now, when you try to buy a car, when Biden passed this legislation under Biden, not only were there subsidies that would give you tax credits if you bought the EV, so a $7,500 tax credit on an EV, um, if it fulfilled what's called local content requirements. And so that gets back to public procurement. So public procurement and government purchasing, a lot of times that it will include what are called local content requirement. And so that means that the parts themselves that go into the end product, a certain percentage of it has to be made in the USA. So, so that leads us to the third pillar. So uh, we've talked about the CHIPS Act, we've talked about the IRA or the Green New Deal, and then the third pillar is called the Made in America Act, and that specifically ties into, again, my more of my expertise with government procurement. And so, Made in America is a type of local content agreement which requires the US federal government, when they purchase items, it could be for concrete, for paving roads, for building new federal buildings. Um, it could be for staplers and shovels. Uh, it could be for, again, telecommunications or railroads. Anything that the federal government is doing in terms of its procurement that we talked about, that was 500 to 600 billion dollars per year, um, that that now faces more scrutiny in terms of higher local content requirements. So there's been a move in order to qualify, um, and really pass that, you know, when the U.S. government, uh, you know, has a contracting, uh, they have contracting officers that they do this. This is their job. They're going down a checklist and they're verifying, does it meet federal statutes and requirements for purchasing? Well, guess what? Now, instead of just checking 55% local content for some types of products, it's moving up to 75%. So it's a scale. It's not happening overnight, but if you actually read um, the published memo from the White House when this came out, um, between 2021 and 2023, the Made in America Act said that that scale is rising over time from 55 to 75%. So it's not that it was only under Biden. There also was this policy under Trump before Biden. And frankly, it originated in 1933 with the Buy America Act. So there has been something on the books, I should say, um, in terms of US government procurement requirements on the books since 1933. But there have typically been a lot more, uh, waivers granted. The requirements typically were targeted at, defense, which has more national security implications. And so it wasn't as widespread. It wasn't applied as widely as it is now. So a colleague of mine and myself, we wrote an op-ed article where we reviewed some of the existing literature on how these types of buy American policies could affect the quality and price of the products that are being bought by the government. And generally, we're not necessarily in favor of it. We want it to be more targeted. We think that an across the board type of blanket requirement on purchasing, uh, in terms of, let's say you're purchasing pencils or low technology agricultural products. Um, in a sense, if the more you discriminate against foreign firms, then you're just going to raise taxpayer expenses, and it's going to reduce the value proposition for American taxpayers. So we support, again, a more customized approach where you're going to have more local content requirements in targeted areas such as national security, environmental areas that are we see as growth opportunities or sensitive sectors.
Yeah, I'm curious about that kind of balancing act that you described, where the that 500 to 600 billion, if we're buying all in America, that it's not going to get us as much, or we're going to have to pay more for those goods and services. So then it's the value proposition that you described for the American taxpayer versus wanting to, support local businesses. And so it's like, how do economists think about that balancing act between supporting American business and supporting the American taxpayer?
Yeah, I mean yeah, there's a famous expression in economics saying there is no solutions, just trade-offs.
Hmm.
So you pull the lever here, and there's going to be, right, intended and unintended consequences over here. And at the end of the day, we really have to remember basic econ fundamentals. Is that um, you know, if we take the approach of let's just give all this business and do all this in-house. It sounds nice. It sounds appealing. And honestly, this tends to get politicians elected, right? Because there's an appeal to buy American and buy in my home state. But what is being given up? And so a lot of times this opportunity cost is not seen. So you see the benefit, but you don't see what is given up. And so what's given up is you're going to have increased strain on the federal budget, okay? And without that other opportunity for more competition from overseas, we see over and over again in economics and economic history is that you close off a market and the firms tend to take that for granted and they're not as innovative. And it hurts with long-term technological change and long-term economic development. So it is a fine balance. And that's why I said you have to pick and choose what are the industries that you really see as having the most linkages, for example, to support the American economy. So that's a good reason to, for example, protect the U.S. auto industry because it's not just the current supply of American cars, but rather analyses that have looked at this look at all of the linkage effects of auto parts, auto suppliers, maintenance shops, repair shops, all so many businesses in the economy actually are downstream and upstream from the car itself. That doesn't happen across all industries and products. So there are ways to, uh, you know, very deliberately, carefully think about where do we intervene and where perhaps do we not. And so I come back to that issue of where you have products that are generally the world has many buyers and many sellers, like agricultural items, where even if we have adversaries that would cut off uh, uh, our availability of avocados or corn, we know that we have friends and allies that we're still going to be able to get corn and avocados from other ally countries. And so it's probably not in the best interest for the US government to slap indiscriminate tariffs of 10, 20% on corn and avocados. You can make a case that, for every, and we've done this actually. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but studies have looked at sugar production, for example. And so there's a very small number of sugar producers still in the United States. Um, but for every job that we save from sugar production, basically the US taxpayer is, or not just in this case, not just US taxpayer, but we all, when we go to the supermarket and we buy our sugar, because we are protecting, we have an extra tariff on sugar, it's not free trade in sugar, so we all pay 25 to 30 cents more, for example, on sugar. And that supports basically a very small number of jobs in the sugar industry. So it's almost like you're paying, some analyses have said that every job in the sugar industry in the United States that's protected. It's basically like we're paying an extra $100,000 for every single job in the sugar industry when their value added is actually a lot less than 100,000. Um, Now, if you're talking about semiconductor chips, or you're talking about autos, or you're talking about um, advanced aerospace, or if you're talking about potential jobs of the future with solar panel technology, wind turbines, then we're talking about something different. And I know this is an area, right, of interest, I think, for you, Joe, right, with sustainability. So you, I would just bring awareness to that. Like you certainly could make a case for some sort of countervailing short-term protection for those green new technologies, because otherwise we know that the Chinese have already applied massive subsidies of some of their green new technologies, and without any sort of countervailing activity, basically the United States will be so far behind the Chinese that we'll really miss out.
Yeah. So I have one more question for you, and it's really just uh,
Mm.
curious what you think the future of this work looks like. What is the future of industrial policy and strategy look like? You talked about a pendulum before. You think the pendulum continues to swing, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, again, a terrific question. I think it is. I think it's going to swing marginally. I think that the Trump Liberation Day that we've gone through. If folks are watching this video much later, we had the Liberation Day, so-called Liberation Day in the United States um, in April, when the Trump administration basically started to use what are called reciprocal tariffs and used a somewhat unspecified formula to determine how much to charge each and every country. The running joke is that even some countries with just penguins were slapped tariffs. Um, so I think what's happening is that the pendulum will return to kind of like regression to the mean, returning to the mean, where globalization, I don't believe, is going to go away. There's just too many benefits to the world in terms of product variety, innovation, reasonable costs when people are on fixed income and fixed paychecks to be able to have reasonable purchasing power. If we just flat out, again, protect every product, every industry, and use you know, uh, protectionist tools in procurement and industrial policy. There's no evidence that countries have flourished for long periods of time just doing that. And so I think we're going to end up a little bit in a new equilibrium, which is I'm actually somewhat optimistic about it, because the 1980s to the 2005 period, where it was just too reliant on outsourcing, too reliant on heck, even Ross Perot, when Ross Perot was running for the presidency in the early 1990s against Bill Clinton, and NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was being discussed. And even Ross Perot, who was a spectacular business person, he knew, he said there's going to be a giant sucking sound of jobs going across the southern border. And NAFTA helped a lot of importers and exporters, but complete reliance on that, or complete reliance on having China produce everything we need, is we're finding out it's not the way to go. So consumers will have to be expected to probably pay some higher prices, modestly higher. I don't see it as 100% pass-through rates. I see that some of the new trade deals that are being crafted by the Trump administration, while sounding outlandish at first, it's more of a bargaining tool. I see it as a bargaining tool for him. And he's asking, he's making an somewhat outlandish statement saying we're going to tax you or tariff you, 80%, knowing in most cases that they'll come to an agreement, here in the middle. And so some of that restructuring, a resetting of the US economy is not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm somewhat bullish on that. I'm bullish on um, green technology moving forward because I think that despite the current administration's concerns about it, I believe that moving forward, the green technology is going to be vitally important to our world. Um, I see strides being made in the auto industry. It's taken a while, but I see it moving forward. You know, it concerned me very much that for so many years the American auto industry kind of rested on its laurels and didn't continue to develop the EV technology until they had to, right? Because the per unit profit was so high on SUVs and big trucks that the average American producer was not keen on developing that technology as much as it could have, unfortunately. So in that respect, I am thankful to our friend Elon Musk for kind of changing the discussion and innovating with Tesla. Now, whether Tesla's, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but whether Tesla's going to be able to, be successful internationally, that remains to be seen because of the rise of BYD and the Chinese companies. But for the short term, I think you need this type of protection in place so that the American auto industry and some of these green technologies have time to harvest and what we say in economics is slide down their learning curve. So they need continued time to slide down their learning curve and reduce their average total cost per car so that they're competitive. If you just open the floodgates now, that would be disastrous for Detroit for the U.S. automakers. So
Well, Travis, thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing your insights. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
absolutely, it was fun talking with you today, and let's catch up some other time.
Okay.